So, yeah, thank you very much for joining us this evening for Robert Jensen's talk. It's a real honor and privilege to have him here. For those of you who don't know him, he's a renowned activist and author who's been writing about male violence against women through the sexual exploitation industries, including pornography, for a long time. His two most well-known books that are dealing with issues that are also going to be talked about in this talk this evening are probably The End of Patriarchy and Getting Off the End of Masculinity. The latter book is no longer in print, but Robert said to just remind you that you can get it for free off his website. So if that's something that you're interested in reading, do just have a look at his website and read it, because it's a really great book. I've still got a copy at home that I probably should reread. So yeah, without further ado, and thank you very much for being here, Robert. Like I said, it's a real honor and a privilege to hear you talk. I've seen you a few times, and having read your books, it's great. So thank you for volunteering your time this evening to come and talk to all of us.
Well, thank you, Bjorn, and thanks to Chris and everybody who helped organize this. It's a real treat. I'm going to talk tonight about what do men tell us about pornography and what does pornography tell us about men. That's our subject. People might be concerned about images, whether there will be any pornographic images, and the answer is no. No slides tonight. Nobody has to endure the actual content of pornography, but I do want to say there's a brief period when I describe some of the themes and the content of contemporary pornography, and even though I do that pretty clinically, it still can be disturbing. But there will be no pictures tonight. You're just forced to look at me. So I'm going to get right into it. But before talking about pornography in men, I want to say a few words about pornography in me. So I have spent my entire adult life working as either a journalist or a professor, and the skills I've developed I have used to understand contemporary pornography and what I would call the other sexual exploitation industries, including prostitution and stripping. And so this presentation is rooted in more than 3 decades of that research and writing. But of course, I'm not a detached observer. Like virtually all men who are part of the post-Playboy generation. It's a term I use to describe myself. The first issue of Playboy came out in 1953, and I was born in 1958. But like virtually all men of my generation, I've used pornography as a child, a young man. I have a very hazy memory of a softcore motorcycle magazine that had pictures of women naked from the waist up. I'm old enough to remember those kind of things. A grade school friend had found that and hid it in his backyard. By the time I was in junior high or middle school, as we call it here, I had discovered where my father hid his pornographic magazines. It was in his dresser drawer, second drawer under the t-shirts. In high school, I had a friend who had perfected the art of sneaking into the local pornographic movie theater. And in my 20s, I used pornography sporadically. And like many men, I felt drawn to the intensity of the experience, but was also very conflicted about using it. So I begin with that very brief autobiographical sketch, not because my early life is so interesting, but precisely because it's not. It's perfectly normal for men of my age to recount these kinds of experiences. Now, the experiences of boys and younger men who grew up with the internet are going to be similar in some ways, but more troubling because of the intensification of both the images and the delivery system. So anyone younger than me will know what I'm talking about. So I started questioning this version of normal, sort of what it meant to be a normal guy, around the age of 30. That's when I went back to graduate school. And I started studying the radical feminist critique of pornography, part of a larger feminist critique of the sexual exploitation of women and men's violence against women. And today, really all I want to do is make the case for this radical feminism to men if you're interested in trying to escape being normal. That is, men who no longer want to struggle to be a real man, whatever that means. And I've said this many times, and I will keep saying it till I'm done on this planet, I think. As men, we are often trained to fear feminists, but radical feminism is not a threat to us. It's in fact, I think, a gift to men. So what I want to do today is in two parts. First, I'm going to describe the content of contemporary pornography and think a bit about what that says about men. That part of the discussion is pretty straightforward, though I think it's rather painful to confront. From there, what I want to do is go forward and talk about what I've heard men say about pornography over these past 3 decades. And that's more complex and actually in some places more hopeful. So the first part is a look at pornographic images. This is material I've been over many times if you've heard me speak before, but I do want to review it. Today I'm going to focus on graphic, sexually explicit material that depicts primarily heterosexual activity produced primarily for heterosexual men, the majority of the consumers. Well, it's true that women's use of pornography has increased in recent years, but the industry still produces material that reflects the male sexual imagination in patriarchy. As a quick footnote, that's also largely true of gay male pornography. I'll say a few more things about that later. Well, I think what contemporary pornography says about men is pretty simple. In contemporary patriarchy, men are socialized to find control of women arousing. Pornography eroticizes domination and subordination, with, of course, the core power dynamic being male over female. Excuse me. So to explain this, I want to start with a little bit of history. The pornography industry largely operated underground, especially in the US, until the late 1960s and the 70s, when it began to become more acceptable in mainstream society. Well, that led to a dramatic increase in the amount of pornography produced, and the United States did become the center of pornography production. That trend expanded even more dramatically with new technologies such as VCRs, DVDs, eventually the internet. Now, the industry's desire to increase profits, like any business in capitalism, it drove the development of what we could think of as sort of new products. In this case, that means a wider variety of sexual acts that showed up in pornographic films. In the beginning of the industry, what I call the standard sexual script in pornography was pretty straightforward. It involved little or no foreplay, oral sex, primarily performed by women on men, vaginal intercourse, and on occasion, anal intercourse. But to keep men from being, bored, satiated, and drifting away, the pornographers had to start introducing new products, new forms of sexual interaction. The first of those changes was the more routine presentation of men penetrating women anally and in increasingly rough fashion, a trend from the 1980s on. Well, I want to pause and ask why that specific sex act became the first place that pornography started innovating. I use that term ironically. Well, I'm going to quote a longtime pornography producer whom I interviewed at an industry trade show. He explained it to me in rather explicit language, so I'll paraphrase, but I asked him, why so much anal penetration in porn? And he said, oh, well, I can tell, that's easy. He said, men know that most women don't want anal sex. He wasn't saying that no women want it, but he said men know that most women don't. He said, so when men get angry at their wives and girlfriends, they think to themselves, and here I'll quote him directly and crassly, he said, they think to themselves, I'd like to fuck her in the ass. But he said, because they can't do it in real life, they love to see it in pornography. Well, when I was interviewing him, I was struck because what that producer was articulating was, of course, a radical feminist critique of pornography. That pornography is not just sex on film, but rather sex in the context of male domination and female subordination. He was just expressing it in his own language. The sexual experience in pornography is made more intense with sex acts that men find pleasurable but they know women may not want. All right. So that was the first big shift in porn. Where did the industry go from there? Well, in the 90s into the 2000s, pornographers, again, seeking to expand market share and profit, continued to do this innovation. So now when you look at pornography online, you'll see routine acts that include slapping and spitting on women, pulling women's hair, and ejaculating not just on women's bodies, which was the traditional so-called money shot, but especially now on their faces, what in the industry they call a facial. So these are the sex practices that show up routinely. What I want to do now, and this is the part where I'll describe the sexual acts in pornography that can be disturbing, but it'll be very brief. I just want to chart the sex acts that became common in pornography following this normalizing of anal sex. And there are 6 of them I'm going to list here. The first is double penetration, which is what the industry calls 2 men penetrating a woman, one vaginally and one anally at the same time. A double vag is industry slang for 2 men penetrating a woman vaginally at the same time. A double anal is 2 men penetrating a woman anally at the same time. Gagging scenes feature the oral penetration of a woman so aggressive that it makes her gag. There's a recent increase in the amount of choking where men forcefully grasp a woman's throat during intercourse, sometimes literally visibly choking them. And then finally, what in the industry they call ATM, which is slang for ass to mouth. That's a scene in which a man removes his penis from the anus of a woman and without any visible cleaning or hygiene, inserts his penis into her mouth or the mouth of another woman. Okay, that's the end of the description of the content of porn. I want to make it clear, these are not idiosyncratic sexual acts that you have to search out or go on the dark web for. This is the day-to-day run-of-the-mill content of a considerable amount of pornography readily available on the internet. Now, even the pornographers acknowledge that they don't really know what's going to come after all of this. As I said, I've interviewed producers, directors at the industry trade show, and I've asked them, what's the next trend coming? And they often shrug, they don't know. One industry veteran told me he's done everything he knows to do to a woman's body, and he can't imagine anything else. He said, and I quote again, "After all, how many dicks can you stick in a girl at one time?" Another director I interviewed, he said much the same thing. He said, where can it go after multiple penetration? He said, we've filled every hole. Another director actually was worried about this, not because of the effects on the women in pornography, but he said porn sex was increasingly resembling what he called circus acts. And he said, again, the thing about it is there's only but so many holes, only but so many different types of penetration that can be executed upon a woman. Well, that's how the industry talks about their business. There is a specific pornographic genre that does expand degradation into another realm. This is what's called interracial porn. And that's been a growing genre in the last couple of decades as well. Films in the interracial category can feature any combination of racial groups, but they all employ very blatant racist stereotypes. The hot-blooded Latina, Black women presented as sexually more animalistic, the demure Asian kind of geisha girl stereotype, women who just love to serve white men. There's the use of immigrant women with the recognition that they're easily exploited because they're undocumented. All of this very common. Also common is extremely racist language, and I'm going to spare you any examples of that. I don't think I have the strength to repeat any of that, and I don't think you need to hear it. Probably the most common interracial scene pairs a white woman with one or more Black men who penetrate her in rough and aggressive fashion. It draws on the racist stereotype of Black men being a threat to the purity of white women. And at the same time, of course, it reveals that white women are really nothing but sluts who seek defilement this way. Now, I want to point out, this is racism so blatant that you can't imagine it in any other media genre. Even more subtle racist tropes that show up in mainstream media are quickly denounced by people in progressive political movements, yet we hear virtually no objection to this blatant racism in pornography. One more category that's been on the rise. This is what my friend Gail Dines, who's probably the leading feminist anti-porn scholar and activist today, Gail calls this pseudo-child pornography. So sexually explicit material using minors is illegal almost everywhere, certainly in the US. And so the mainstream porn industry, which of course just wants to make money, stays away from actual child pornography, or what we now call child exploitation, sexual exploitation materials, to recognize it's not pornography, really, it's the documentation of the abuse of children. But the industry does take young-looking adult women, that is, women over the age of 18, but who look much younger, and places them in very childlike settings. The classic image is a very petite woman, usually white, in a Catholic girls' school uniform or something like that. And it creates the impression that adult men can have, the high school cheerleader of their fantasies. Actually, I don't know if you all have the same cheerleader category in the UK, but it's a big thing in the US here. Another popular version of this kind of material features stepfathers having sex with teenage stepdaughters. This material, I want to point out, is not marketed specifically to pedophiles. It's part of the mainstream pornography market for, what we would think of as ordinary guys. I'm going to sum this up by quoting again my friend Gail Dines, who in an interview described contemporary pornography this way. She said, "Today's mainstream internet porn is brutal and cruel, with body-punishing sex acts that debase and dehumanize women." And that phrase that I first heard Gail use years ago, body-punishing sex acts, really does capture a lot about the contemporary porn industry. Now, I said I would say something about gay pornography, so let me just comment on that real briefly. The same analysis that I just articulated, the radical feminist analysis of straight porn, is applicable to gay porn. Now, gay pornography obviously features sex between men, and so the male domination, female subordination dynamic is not present. But in gay porn, you see other inequality dynamics like top and bottom, age differentials, that sort of thing, that also, involve the eroticizing of power. And in gay porn, you'll also see these same racist themes. So my focus has been on the straight porn world, but the gay porn world is not exempt from the same kind of analysis. Now, to sum up this part of it, let me be clear about what I'm not saying. These patterns that I observe in porn doesn't mean that every man will be aroused by this material. It doesn't mean that all men use the same material. And it certainly doesn't mean that men are drawn to this material because of some immutable biological drive that can't be changed. In a sense, what I'm arguing is pornography doesn't tell us anything about the essence of men. What pornography tells us about is the construction of male sexuality in patriarchy. And I know patriarchy is kind of an old-fashioned word, but I think it's still important. Patriarchy is a social system, after all, that's only a few thousand years old. It's not the entire history of the human species. Human beings have been around, modern human Homo sapiens, for several 100,000 years. And patriarchy is not the norm in all of human history. In fact, it's a rather recent deviation from the way humans organize themselves for about 95% of our evolutionary history. So we aren't talking about men for all time. We're talking in the pornography analysis about men in patriarchy. So what does pornography tell us about men? It tells us that in patriarchy, we are socialized to seek control over women, and that when necessary, we're trained to use coercion and violence to obtain that sexual pleasure. In other words, pornography tells us something very disturbing about how we men are socialized in patriarchy. Okay. From there, I want to move to what men say about pornography. And here I want to shift from a more historical and analytical account to just tell some stories from my public presentations about pornography, which I started doing in the early 1990s. So again, about 3 decades worth of this. While the misogyny and the racism in pornography have intensified over time, which is an unambiguously destructive trend, I think men's reactions to pornography are going to turn out to be more complex. And I do think, however, that in men's reaction, there is an underlying theme that I'll come to at the end, and that is men's fear. I want to conclude with that. So here are 4 stories of what men have said to me about pornography over the years. The first time I ever spoke in public about pornography was during my graduate studies at the University of Minnesota, when I was an occasional co-presenter of an anti-pornography slideshow created by the feminist public education group called Organizing Against Pornography. And when I say slideshow, I'm old enough to mean slides, slide carousels that went around, not PowerPoint presentations. So anybody my age can smile at that. So the first time I co-presented at the University of Minnesota, I noticed there was a college-aged couple, heterosexual couple, in the front row, and they were kind of leaning into each other in a way that suggested they were in a committed relationship. Both of them looked very animated, eager to hear the presentation. They were talking to each other before it began. But after the slideshow, which included a lot of very disturbing images, I noticed the man moved to put his arm around the shoulder of the woman. And as the discussion period intensified, as it often did after that show, and women started expressing their anger, which happened all the time, I noticed that this man's hand moved from around his girlfriend to on the back of her neck, and he kept it there for the remainder of the presentation with his hand clearly grasping this woman's neck. Now, he seemed unaware of the shift in his body and his position. And my guess is it was probably unconscious, but of course, I can't know what he was thinking or what he intended. But it was hard not to notice that as more women in the room challenged not only men's use of pornography, but challenged men's behavior more generally, the more uneasy he seemed to be. And his response, whatever he was thinking, was to physically exert some control over his girlfriend. One can guess that perhaps the feminist critique had hit a little too close to home. Now, he didn't speak during that discussion period, nor did his girlfriend. But there were lots of other men in the room, and they did speak up. And as they often did in that period, they defended men's use of pornography. They argued that the feminist critique we were presenting was prudish and anti-sex and those kind of things. So at that time, in the early 1990s, my experience was that most men in the audiences were not interested in a critique of the sexual norms in patriarchy. And often some of those men were extremely angry. That shifted, however. As I said, that program was in the early 1990s, which was just about the time that the lively debate that had been going on within feminism about pornography was coming to a close. So in the 1980s, there were feminists who identified as anti-pornography, the women I worked with. And then there was another group of feminists who called themselves anti-censorship, and they expressed concerns about any intervention into the production or use of pornography, and even opposed the feminist proposal at the time, which was to move pornography regulation outside of the criminal law and adopt a civil rights approach. But that was too much even for the anti-censorship feminists. But that debate, as I said, kind of was winding down. And within a few years, the debate between anti-pornography and anti-censorship feminists had become eclipsed by a more explicitly pro-pornography feminism. And my point is that gave a lot of cover to men who didn't want to self-reflect about this. In other words, instead of, angrily defending their own pornography use, now men could simply say, well, they were embracing the pro-pornography feminism that was allegedly all about sexual freedom. Well, I ran into this approach more and more, and especially I seem to see it at the elite universities, I think, where this pro-pornography feminism tended to be the strongest. And I want to tell a story from one of those presentations at a prestigious West Coast university in the United States that I probably shouldn't name, but it was Stanford, what the heck. I just, in one part of my presentation, I described the common sex acts depicted in pornography that I summarized just a few minutes ago, and then opened it up for discussion. And one man raised his hand. I remember him having what I thought was a particularly smug look on his face, very satisfied with himself. And he said he wanted to point out what he thought was a fatal flaw in my argument. So I was interested to hear. And here's what he said. He said, "You're assuming that double anal is painful." He said, "What if women like it?" Well, my initial reaction was probably unkind. I wanted to suggest that he go into the next room perhaps and himself experience a double anal, and then he could report back to us on whether it was painful or not. But I didn't say that, of course. Instead, I said, yes, I was indeed assuming that a double anal would be painful for most women, although I recognize that people can train their bodies to endure a lot of pain. When you think about, elite athletes and how they train their bodies to be flexible and do things that most of us can't do. But I also said that in the many public presentations I had made to date, I had yet to see a woman in the audience respond with enthusiasm to descriptions of these multiple penetration scenes. So yes, I assume that for the most part, double anal is painful. But then I went on and I pointed out something I think more important. I said, even if every woman who was ever used in a double anal scene enjoyed it, most of the men watching that scene assume she's in pain. While most of the female performers in pornography act as if everything is pleasurable, including multiple penetrations, in those double anal scenes, when you watch closely, whatever the vocalizations of pleasure women make, you can see that they're holding their body often in a way that suggests they're just trying to endure the experience. And, men aren't stupid. They know that in everyday life, there are very few women seeking double anal penetration. So no matter what the specific experience of any one woman, the sexual excitement for male viewers is coming from watching a sex act that they know that women do not seek out and that virtually all women would find painful. I don't think that's hard to imagine. So again, this brings us back to the feminist analysis that pornography is not just sex on film, but sex in the context of domination and subordination. And some men like to watch women being forced to engage in sex acts that hurt. That is one manifestation of that dynamic. My point is that this pro-pornography feminism made it a lot easier for men to avoid facing what I think is that very basic fact. All right, well, let's go forward again. By the 2010s, the use of increasingly cruel and degrading online pornography had become pretty routine for men in the United States. I've talked to a lot of women, especially younger women, who say they would rather date men who didn't use pornography, but they simply don't know any. I talked to a high school student once who said he told his friends that he didn't use pornography and no one believed him. They said, you don't have to be afraid of admitting it. We all do it. So pornography is increasingly normalized and men are increasingly open about their use. And I want to give you an example of this. This comes from a screening of the 2008 documentary called The Price of Pleasure, a film I was involved with. And I was presenting that film at Texas State University, just down the road from where I lived in Austin, Texas. Now, I expected a small group. Most of the time when I speak about these things, it's to a very small group of people. But when I got down to Texas State, I found an auditorium filled with hundreds of students. It was not because I was so popular, but because it turned out several professors had required attendance for their class. So I was introducing the film and getting increasingly nervous because the audience, excuse me, because the audience was so jocular, so lighthearted. And that tone continued during the screening itself, making me very uncomfortable. Then, as the film presented a very intense scene that featured the sexual degradation of women, a number of the men started giggling and then laughing out loud. This went on for about a minute, and I asked the hosts to stop the film. And I went back to the podium to talk to the group. And I said, listen, I know that sexual material can be uncomfortable, and one of the ways we all deal with uncomfortable realities sometimes is to laugh about it and joke about it. Sexually assaulted and harassed. I didn't know which women had experienced sexual violence, of course. I said, but in a group of this size, you can be sure there are very many women who have experienced that kind of assault. And so I said especially to the men, I said, before you laugh at descriptions of sexual cruelty, remember that the woman next to you may be one of those victims. And how do you think she might feel about your laughter? A brief aside, one of the things about talking about this subject I've learned is that I never know what's going to hit me emotionally. And the reason I paused is because I was remembering back to that evening, and it was a very, very difficult evening. And it just caught me short, so apologies. So I said, you know, how do you think a woman who's been raped, who's sitting right next to you, is going to feel about you laughing at that? And then I said, apart from the specific experience of any woman, how do you think a woman at all would feel about you laughing at this kind of depiction of a sexualized degradation? Well, that changed the mood of the room. Everybody was quiet. We went back to the film, and the discussion that followed was much more sober and serious. Women spoke up about their fear, their anger, and even eventually a few men talked about some of their struggles with pornography. But the students who stayed to talk afterward, after the program had ended, were mostly women. And I watched. Most of the men were eager to get out of that auditorium when the program was finally over. All right. One more story to illustrate what men say about pornography. This comes from my most recent presentations, because by the 2010s, it was really becoming more common for men to talk openly about how pornography was affecting them and affecting them negatively. Now, for most of these men, this self-awareness didn't come from the feminist critique, but rather their own experience, the emotional distress they were feeling about their own pornography use, which they reported was distorting their sexual imaginations and interfering in their sex lives. And I remember very clearly the first time anyone ever said that to me. It was a young man at a campus presentation. And after my lecture and the discussion was over, again, people hang around to chat informally, and we were talking. And as the crowd thinned out, I saw this young man in the back of the room, and he clearly was waiting for everybody else to leave before he approached me to talk, which he did. And he was thankful for the program. He said the critique was new to him, but gave him a lot to think about. But then he eventually got around to what he really wanted to tell me. And he said that he'd used pornography regularly since he was in middle school, which is not unusual. He said it was becoming increasingly hard for him to function sexually with his girlfriend in the real world because of that porn use. He said during sex, it had always felt like there was a porn loop going in his head, a kind of constant set of images. And that no matter how he tried, he really couldn't get rid of them. More recently, he said he was having trouble achieving and maintaining an erection during sex with his girlfriend without thinking about pornographic scenes. Now he said, I love my girlfriend. I want to stop using pornography, but I just haven't been able to quit. And as you can imagine, he was very nervous about acknowledging this, but there was also, I could see a kind of weight lifted. I have a feeling I might be the first person he ever said that to out loud. Well, I told him, as I always remind people, I'm not a trained therapist. I'm not qualified to provide counseling. But I said, I did know he was not the only man struggling with their use of pornography. And I gave him the advice, the only advice I ever really have for men, which is if you try to deal with this by yourself, right, you'll fail. Because like any problematic behavior, especially any kind of addiction, the route to health is in breaking out of your isolation, understanding that others also struggle, that you're not alone, and finding some support. Now, for a lot of us, therapy has been part of that, but I also think it's really important to find a community of like-minded men to talk through this with. And since that conversation I had now many years ago with that young man, probably more than a decade ago, men have started creating online networks to share their struggles and to help each other. The two I'm most familiar with are called NoFap, N-O-F-A-P. FAP is an internet slang term for masturbation. And NoFap is a website dedicated to helping men quit pornography. Another one is called Reboot Nation, like, rebooting your imagination like a computer. Now, a lot of these younger men came together after reading another good website called Your Brain on Porn, which was founded by the late Gary Wilson, a man who did a lot of amazing work on this and sadly died this past year. Now, if you talk to psychologists, they'll debate about whether pornography is addictive in the traditional sense or not. But these men are dealing with how to break cycles of use that they very much experience as an addiction. So I'm very glad this is happening. I'm glad men are facing the struggle of their pornography use, how it's affected them. But I also want to point out, I think that's just a first step, that placing your own self-defeating and dysfunctional behavior in the context then of a feminist critique of patriarchy, not only is going to be better for you as a man, but it's also going to open up possibilities to contribute to a feminist movement to protect women and girls from men's sexual violence. So I think the personal experience can lead us to the feminist analysis, which is in everybody's interests. And I mean, very specifically, it is in men's interest, because I think the one thing a radical feminist critique of pornography and men's violence more generally can really do for men is help us deal with our fear. And this is where I'm gonna wrap up. In my experience, whether men celebrate pornography or worry about its effects on them, whether men are angry or they're anxious about it, there is a common denominator, and that's fear. Some men are afraid someone is going to take away the material that they think they need to experience sexual pleasure. Other men are afraid of what that form of obtaining sexual pleasure does to their ability to function sexually outside of the pornographic world in their real life. And men are often afraid of losing control. For some men, that means losing control over what they consider their women, or losing control over ourselves, right? So I think this fear, men's fears, support patriarchy. Now, obviously, institutionalized male dominance, which is all I mean when I say patriarchy, that creates for women and girls a very legitimate fear of, among other things, men's sexual violence and men's violence more generally. But men in patriarchy also live with fear that I think keeps us trapped. Now, again, I'm going to be clear. If you compare the injuries visited upon women and girls to men's struggles in patriarchy, we're not talking about anything near the same severity, right? Patriarchy is a threat to women and girls, discrimination, the ever-present threat of sexual violence in ways that men will never know. But I think that patriarchy very clearly does diminish men's capacity, especially to experience the full range of human emotions. So I think we men have to think about our own fear as well. And where it comes from, well, where it comes from is pretty clear. It comes from the obsession with competition that is at the core of patriarchy, which leads to a really pathological need to control others and ourselves, usually because we're pursuing some kind of conquest that we have been trained to think is in our best interests. So men are socialized to seek control of both our own emotions and the behavior of others. That control is aimed at taking what we come to believe often is rightfully ours, which for many includes the sexual gratification from women. All right. One of the ways I've summed this up is I've described patriarchy as a lifelong contest of king of the hill. Now, I don't know if anybody remembers that game or played that game when they were children, but it was present in my childhood. King of the Hill was a very simple game in which you found a hill or some higher ground, and everybody tried to pull down the one boy who was at the top of the hill. And that's kind of patriarchy. It creates not only a domination-subordination dynamic between men and women, but it also creates this very corrosive competition between men in a world where, in some sense, only one man can be king, so nobody is ever safe. Everybody's either trying to get up to be the king, or the king, of course, then has to repel other men. Well, after conversations with a lot of men over a lot of years, one thing I've come to believe is that at some point in our lives, virtually all men are afraid that they don't measure up, that we aren't man enough, whatever that means again, right? And that men are deeply afraid that they will never be the real man that they're told they should be. So let me pause. Somebody might be saying to themselves, well, wait, that's not what I believe. That's not how I was raised. That's not how I behave. Well, okay, I suppose it's possible that there are men who were never affected by this cultural training in the dominant masculinity. Maybe it's possible there are boys who were never affected by other boys or adult men warning them not to cry like a girl. Maybe there are boys who were never affected by the steady stream of movies and television shows that I remember that depicted tough guys who always triumph in the end by using violence to get what they want. And maybe there are boys who've never been affected by seeing male power all around them, or being told, depending on your religious background, that the ultimate power to be worshipped is a he. Right? Maybe there are men who've escaped all that. And I suppose in behavioral terms, it's possible there are men who have never leveraged being male for personal advancement, men who've never failed to stand up against sexism in the workplace to make sure that women always got a fair shake. Maybe there are men who have never used women or other men in pornography or in the sexual exploitation industries. Maybe there's men who've never told a sexist joke. I acknowledge it's possible there are such men. I've just never met one. And I don't exempt myself from these descriptions either, right? In other words, what I'm saying is I don't think I've ever met a man who at some point in his life had not been afraid that he was not man enough. And that fear is what I'm suggesting feminism can help us face. Now, excuse me, as with any system of unearned privilege and power, right, which is patriarchy, it gives men privilege and power that has not been earned. It can be really difficult for those of us who are on top of such systems to see how it shaped us. And our best hope of seeing that in the case of sex, I think, is feminism, especially the radical feminism that I first encountered in that anti-pornography movement more than 30 years ago. And to repeat, that's why I keep saying that radical feminism is not a threat, but is a gift to men, because it helps us to see the world more clearly, and it helps us to see ourselves more honestly. And I think that's where the possibility for self-healing begins. A feminist analysis, when it's combined with critical self-reflection, both individually and collectively, I think can offer us a way out of the traps that patriarchal notions of masculinity have set for us. If we can overcome our fear, we can be part of a movement that can limit and maybe even someday eliminate the damage that men do to girls and women. But just as important, I think, to emphasize, radical feminism is also a movement that gives us, men, the chance to really become fully human. And that is what it has helped me struggle with. So with that, I'll stop talking. I'll turn it back to Bjorn, who is going to moderate the conversation. And I would just say that in addition to questions, people reflecting on their own experience and their own insights is also welcome. There's a lot of folks in this session who I'm sure have as much or more insight into this as I do. So looking forward to the conversation. Back to you, Bjorn.
Thank you, Robert. And yeah, thank you for an amazing talk. I really, really enjoyed that. And one of the things that, always really strikes me when you talk about it is how you don't shy away from, talking about your own experience and, being there and saying, I've never met a man who hasn't been sexist and I'm one of them because, that's how I feel. I used to watch a lot of pornography, and that comment where you said about how I've never met a man who wasn't scared of not measuring up, not being man enough, really struck a chord with me. So thank you for that. I think that honestly is really refreshing. And I think that's one of the things that we do need a lot of, and it proves the point that you made earlier. You can't deal with those things on your own. So I think you're doing that by talking so openly about your experience as well. And it's just great to hear, I think.
Can I interrupt real briefly? Because I want to make a very important point. I'm grateful for that. And I have tried to stay honest. But the reason I think that was the path I was on is because those women in that feminist anti-pornography group I worked with, and especially one male volunteer I worked with, were really intent upon not letting me or other men get away with anything less than that. And so I had role models, mostly women, but also a few men. And they held me to that. And I wanted to acknowledge that because, academic life is full of modes of evasion. And I feel like I was kind of saved, not by people in academic life, but by those women and that one man. So sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to say that.
No, I think that's great. And I think the same goes for me because it was my partner who, did that for me. So, I think it's great to acknowledge that and just also, again, to be honest about that. So yeah, we've had lots of questions coming in whilst you've been talking. I'm going to try and get through as many of them as possible. I think some of them, did sort of get addressed throughout by some of the later comments that you made. But I guess I just wondered, because you did touch upon that earlier, there was a question about, the fear that young men being educated by extreme pornography and the result of that in, the sexual violence against women and girls, and the connections of that, if there's any, do you know if any sort of, research that's being done about that recent, and, if you can point us to that, that'd be great.
Yeah. There is, when I first started working on this issue, there was very little social science research being done. And now there is a flood of it, more than I can keep up with. So I'm gonna refer people to the website for a group called Culture Reframed. That is Gail Dine's website. Gail, like me, is a retired professor now, and she's running a really wonderful pornography education group called Culture Reframed, and you'll find resources there. Another place I'll send you it's called NCOSE. I always forget, National Coalition on Sexual Exploitation, or the National Committee. I always forget which one it is. And that's actually a more religious group. They're rooted in a Christian faith, which is not the source for the radical feminist criticism, but there are some commonalities. But the reason I point to it is because they've been engaged in this work for a long time, and they have another excellent resource page. They have a staff person who keeps up on all of those things. The other place I already mentioned is Your Brain on Porn, Gary Wilson's website, which goes through a lot of the neuroscience, especially because that's a new area of research that wasn't around when I first started. So there is, systematic academic research on this, but just as important are the what we tend to call the anecdotal evidence. And of course, anecdotes are more than just idiosyncratic stories. You start to see patterns in them. And everybody I know who works in some form of sex education or works with younger people around these issues, they all have heard the same stories about how pornography is becoming essentially the default sex education for boys. That's especially true in the United States, where because of our peculiar culture, we don't really have very effective sex education in the schools. The churches tend to avoid it. Parents are nervous about it. So this is very, very common. The way I usually sort of summarize this is to quote a woman who is a sex educator on an American university campus. And I'll do this from memory, but it's pretty close. And she said, when she works with young men, think of the average 18-year-old guy who comes to college. She tells them on a first date, don't choke your partner, don't ejaculate onto their face, and don't try to have anal sex with them. And when I read that, I thought, well, why would you need to tell a young man not to do any of those things, especially on a first date? Isn't that kind of obvious? And her point was obvious also, which is young men who are raised on internet pornography take these sexual acts to be normal. And we're hearing more and more of that. I mentioned the period where anal sex became more and more common in pornography. And I've talked to many, many women who in their personal lives have said, ever since then, that's often, a discussion on the first date. Do you do anal? Well, I'm old enough to remember, and again, I'm not being moralistic or policing people's sexual practices. I'm just pointing to an obvious pattern that these are things people are learning from pornography, and both the experience people have talking to young men and women and the more systematic research all points to the same thing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for that, Robert. That's really helpful. And I think one of the people that I also wanted to just quickly mention, because I read about her research recently, is Fiona Vera Gray. I listened to her on a podcast recently, and she's doing some really interesting studies about pornography, and also about the content of pornography, which you also talked about, looking at what is mainstream pornography and what kind of behavior they're actually showing, whilst their terms and conditions say they would never show that kind of stuff, which is really violent pornography. And I guess it sort of ties into the question of which we've had a couple actually, and I know it's a big question to ask, but I guess, we are aware that there's legislation. There has been legislation for a long, long time. Pornography shouldn't be accessible for people of a certain age. I grew up, I'm probably the first boom of kids who grew up on pornography, being 40. We got it when I was maybe 15, so it's, it's already 1-2 generations have grown up on this, and it's still not regulated. There is a lot of talk about, prostitution being a choice and all of those kind of things. And I guess the question that has come back in the chat a couple of times is how can we, break free from the grip of the porn industry, the sexual exploitation industry, who are all telling us this is fine, this is liberal, this is people, women's choices, and trying to give us stories that confirm that, whilst a lot of the time just completely negating the fact that that is not the experience of the vast majority of people.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that, so I'll try and be concise. First of all, almost everything that I described in my talk is technically illegal in the United States. You could easily prosecute it under criminal obscenity law. But for that to happen, there has to be the political will. So in the US, we used to say there's a lot of difference between what's legal in Manhattan, Kansas, which is a small town, and Manhattan, New York. In other words, it was geographic. When you went to small towns in rural America, you probably wouldn't find much pornography. You went to the big city, you did. But of course, the internet erased those differences. And the fact is there is simply not the political will in the United States to use the criminal law to prosecute this stuff. It happens very rarely, except, as I said, when there are children involved. Okay. The feminist movement in the 1980s said that that's part of the problem with criminal obscenity law. It's very heavy-handed, but it doesn't even work. And that's why I mentioned the civil rights approach to use civil rights law. Okay, that's a long story. It ended up not being successful in the US. But today, I will confess I'm not sure what can be done. One thing that's clear is there is a possibility for age verification online. And in fact, the UK is ahead of most everybody else in that. I've been told they've used age verification very successfully for online gambling, and there's no reason the same technologies couldn't be used for pornography. But we all know that even with that kind of age verification, you're not going to stop the flood, right? Which is a combination not just of the technology, but of the culture as well. So, you know, if I had a magical solution, I would have published it long ago, but I don't. There are a lot of social problems we face now at the intersection of capitalism and technology, and then racism and sexism that do not have simple answers, and this is one of them. So I'll just confess, I don't really have a very good insight. I would like to see the feminist civil rights approach tried again. I think there's some real possibilities there. But beyond that, I think everybody is struggling to figure out, beyond public education, beyond trying to educate generations, you know, the newer, especially younger generations. It's hard to say. And I realize that when I don't have a good answer, I talk too long, so I'm going to shut up. That's all I can say.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think, you know, you've really hit on something there as well. I think in this age of internet, it's really difficult to get legislation locally, but then, you know, if that's not there, then it's global anyway. So it's, you know, what needs to happen there? So they're quite complex questions, because also I'm aware of the fact that, you know, some gambling companies, if it's not legal somewhere, they'll just put the main hub on an island where it is legal, and then they just do it all from there online. So it is tricky.
Yeah. I do want to go back. I'm sorry, there was another part of the question. And I want to emphasize the incredible harm that this pro-pornography feminism has done. Now, I always point out, I'm a man. It's not my place to tell women what to think. But I can say without question that men have hidden behind this surge of pro-porn feminism. Now, intellectually, when I read pro-porn feminism, I don't think it's very compelling. I don't think it's very interesting. I think it ignores a lot of the reality of the sexual exploitation industries. But I can report that it has had a really detrimental effect on men who hide behind it. I've written at some length about this and why the left, and I consider myself part of the political left in the United States. I'm anti-capitalist, I'm anti-imperialist, you know, I'm for the revolution. But in a way, I'm a bit of an outlier, that most left men and even a lot of left women embrace the so-called sex work perspective. And I've written about why I think that is, but it's really detrimental, obviously to the women who are exploited in these industries, but also to all of us, I think.
Okay, that's really great. Thank you very much for that. And I mean, based on the questions, we could probably go on for another hour or so. I think everybody's really just enjoyed it. And, you know, I'm aware that we've taken up quite a bit of your time, but I guess in the interests of, you know, just sticking to the schedule, I just want to say, you know, sort of how, actually, where are we? Oh no, it's 8 o'clock, isn't it? We said 8:30, didn't we? Sorry, I got confused for a second.
I wondered. I thought you were just trying to cut me off, and I thought,
no,
okay.
No, I just completely
no, go ahead.
Completely missed that one. I guess, you know, it's there was a question that came in, you know, about that ties in with that sort of like, you know, not knowing the answers to how to regulate porn websites, but you know, what's your views on sort of resources that can help combat something in some ways, the massive influence of the media? Do you think there's anything that can be done there?
Yeah, I think that I'm not sure I'm going to have a direct answer, but it brings up something that's very much on my mind, which is that pornography is a problem in media, but there is a larger problem of media. And some people might think I'm just sounding like an old man, and it's true enough, I am an old man. But I always say there are three problems in contemporary America. We are over-medicated. There is a rush to treat every distressful emotional condition with drugs, which I think, while medication is often very important, often life-saving, we're over-medicated. We're not dealing with reality too often and are too quick to take a pill. We're over-marketed. There's far too much shopping in the United States. People cope with distressing feelings by buying. And I also think we're over-mediated, not just in the realm of pornography, but in the way that so much of our experience, especially the experience of young people, it comes through a screen. And, for millions of years, our species didn't evolve in front of screens. And I think it takes us out of a direct connection to the world, the natural world, and to each other in ways that I think we have to think about. Now, I'm not renouncing all communication technology. I have a phone, I use Zoom, media or social media, but that we have to think about how it changes us. And I think pornography is in a way the most obvious way it changes us. It literally rewires, the sexual connections in our brain. It changes behavior. And I think if we were paying attention, we would recognize that pornography is kind of like, as they say, the canary in the coal mine. It should be telling us that this over-mediated world is dangerous. Now, in the United States and around the world, a huge discussion about this in terms of social media, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera. And it won't surprise anybody that I don't have any solutions to those problems of disinformation and the abuse of social media either. But I think this is my kind of cop-out. You can't solve a problem until you recognize it as a problem. And right now, too much of mainstream culture doesn't recognize pornography as a problem. And I don't think it's because everybody loves porn. I think it's because people are terrified. And I think that's true of a lot of the modern world. Things have developed that seem to be outside of our control, and we're terrified by it. And I think the first thing is for people, in family settings, in school settings, in social settings, to just say, here's what I'm afraid of. I think that's really important. I often say, I think, because nobody ever invites me to parties anymore. I don't have any friends left. So I'm in fewer spaces where I want to bring these things up. But bringing up difficult subjects with friends and family is probably one of the most important things we can do.
Yeah, and it is difficult as well, because I think a lot of the time we're not really taught how to bring up those difficult things. That can be a real struggle and something that, a lot of people have to learn. I was just wondering about, there was a question in the chat about the connection sort of between, pornography and, things like films that, and cinemas, and how sex is portrayed in those. And I just wonder sort of what your thoughts are about that and the impact that, the big pornography industry might have on that.
Yeah. Again, here I'm going to quote Gail Dines, who I've worked with for, 25, 30 years now. And I've learned so much from Gail. It's probably because she's British born, although she abandoned you all, came to the US. But Gail talks that not only has the mainstream culture become more pornographic, but pop culture has also started to. In other words, pornography comes into mainstream culture and pop culture gets more pornographic at the same time. And there's a lot of feminist criticism that's been pointing this out, for the last 40, 50 years. If you look at fashion advertising, many people have pointed out that there are pornographic conventions. By conventions, we just mean the way that photographs get taken, the way things get done. you see a lot of very pornographic-like poses for women in fashion advertising. Of course, mainstream media, whether it's network television, cable television, Hollywood movies, what I grew up on in the US, has become far more pornographic and more sexually explicit. And not just that any mention of sex is bad. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the presentation of sexuality has become more pornographic in pop culture. So as Gail points out, as the culture gets more pornographic, with the presence of graphic sexually explicit material, it also, in a sense, gets more pornographic as mainstream media start to reflect those same presentation styles and values. And that should be of great concern to us also. Again, it's a problem that doesn't have an easy solution. I don't want to become, the censor that tells movie makers what they can produce. That's not the answer. But again, recognizing that is really important, I think. I mean, people have pointed out that if you look at Instagram or any of these other social media that feature photographs, you'll see a lot of women, especially younger women, presenting themselves as objectified bodies for male viewing, because that's how you become popular. I'm not blaming the girls and young women who do this, obviously, but this is another way in which the culture is more and more pornographic. You can see it on something like Instagram.
Okay, thank you very much for the points that you made there. I have a question here, which I think is quite interesting. You might have sort of addressed it already, but do you think that the consumption of pornography sort of plays into men getting satisfaction from a certain kind of sexual interaction that's not really consensual, and how do those two affect each other?
Yeah, I think that's a really important and, in a way, a very disturbing point that we have to deal with. So we know that consent is never a simple yes or no, in which all parties have equal power and equal awareness. One of the patterns you see in women reporting about their own sexual lives is the frequency with which they agree to sexual activity out of a desire to please a boyfriend or a husband or something like that. I mean, that's well established. Well, if that's how you're raised, to believe that your value in a relationship is to keep your male partner happy, well, that's not surprising. There's another phenomenon that I remember reading and hearing about from women more than 10, 15 years ago now, which involves the way that women will consent to some sex acts to preclude the possibility of sexual violence. And in the US, there was a study of college-age women about this, where they find themselves on a date, and let's say they're in, a dorm room with a male they've been out on a date with, and it starts to get sexually more intense than the woman wants, but she realizes she's vulnerable. The man is bigger, stronger, whatever. And so women will report engaging in some sex acts, like, let's say, oral sex, because they fear being raped. All right. Now, is that consensual? Well, it's not, rape in the traditional sense that could be legally demonstrated. But that woman's participation in that sex act was not wholly, sought after. So the world is messy like this. And when you have a whole generation of young men who are being trained to believe that sex, much like the acts I described in my talk, constitute normal sexual behavior between men and women. And I've talked to young men who say, well, what's wrong with that? I see it in pornos all the time. It's just the way women are, right? And the flip side, of course, is not only that men are being trained, but women, because they're exposed to porn or exposed to a porn culture, are also being trained in a certain way to accept that. I've talked to younger women who say they didn't realize that it wasn't right to be choked. This choking is I've been talking to people about it recently, and it's really disturbing. And so, yeah, the consent question is really complicated. And it's complicated under the best of circumstances. And it gets much more disturbing in a pornographic world where both boys and girls, young men and young women, are being subjected to these messages. And remember, these messages come at you directly, indirectly, and they come at you sexualized. You know, sometimes people say, well, everybody knows porn is just fantasy. Well, no, everybody doesn't know that, number one. And number two, fantasies still have an effect on how we come to see the world. And remember that, and here I'll be blunt, for men especially, pornography is largely a masturbation facilitator, which means that they're taking those images in and seeing those messages reinforced in the context of sexual arousal and orgasm. And I don't know, you know, I don't want to be glib about it, but I don't think most of us do our best critical thinking when we're sexually aroused. In other words, we're in a state where we're more susceptible to those messages taking root literally in our body. And that's why those young men who have told me over and over, and told Gail and told many other people, that they can no longer achieve an erection without thinking about pornography. I mean, that is, I think, all the evidence we need in some sense.
Yeah, that last comment you made about, you know, not being able to, you know, get an orgasm unless you know, it's a certain way. It made me think about what you said earlier about addiction and that sort of cycle of, you know, the release from orgasm, which is like, you know, the reward system part of that, but then it's linked to all the abusive behavior that you're seeing on screen. And I guess that's sort of where it ties into, you know, pornography addiction that is sometimes talked about.
That's an important point, because for a long time, those of us in the feminist movement were very skeptical about calling men's habitual use of pornography an addiction. And the reason was we wanted to stay focused on the politics of patriarchy and not turn it into a mental health issue, right? Although there are obviously mental health components to it. But I don't worry about calling porn an addiction anymore, because the evidence is now piled up to such a degree that I think it's quite obvious it is. Some psychologists reject this, but you know, we routinely talk about addiction to gambling, to extreme sports. You know, we talk about behavioral addictions all the time that don't involve traditional drugs and alcohol. So we know that brain chemistry, you know, how it's affected by some of these behaviors. And so I do think it's appropriate to refer to pornography as an addiction. Those two websites I talked about, Reboot Nation and NoFap, if you go online, you'll see a wide variety of comments. Some of it, you know, I don't quite understand, but you know, it's an online forum, so you see a lot of different things. But you will see consistently young men who have no physiological problems reporting what they now call porn-induced erectile dysfunction, the inability to achieve an erection without pornography, right? For men who have no physical symptoms that would lead you to think they have a physiologically based erectile dysfunction problem. Well, again, what can you say about that? Except we, as Gail does say, we've been running in some ways a huge unregulated social experiment by subjecting young people to online pornography with no controls and seeing what happens, right? And we're starting now to have pretty clear evidence about what does happen. And when we think about it like that, the kind of cruelty of it, not only the cruelty that the women in pornography experience, but the kind of more generalized cruelty to a whole generation or two, really comes home for me.
Yes, thank you. I think, you know, I really appreciate the points that you made there. I think it's interesting to me to hear that there is, you know, such a thing as sort of porn-induced erectile dysfunction, something that's really new to me, but it makes sense in the context of what you've described, and you know, the way that it works. I guess, you know, there was a question in the chat as well about, you know, films, and somebody here quoted to Don John, which you may have seen or not, but it's sort of like on that theme of, you know, a guy that watches a lot of porn and then sort of finds himself, unable to get aroused without pornography. And the question was about whether there is a space, I guess, for trying to teach our children, I guess, in this case, but also men, about intimacy and about, I guess, vulnerability, because I guess that comes with intimacy. And you spoke a lot about fear. So I think those things are, I would think, intertwined. If you can be vulnerable, then you can be intimate, but then fear can stop you from that. So I was wondering about your thoughts on that.
I agree completely, and I'll just sort of reinforce what you just said. When I talk about sexuality, I say that the older I get, the more I think of sexuality as a kind of form of communication. Right now, sex plays a different role in our lives as we age. Obviously, it has a reproductive function. It's for pleasure, but it's also the way we get to know other people. And when I think of my most, profound sexual experiences, they don't have much to do with techniques or, mind-blowing orgasms or all the kind of stuff you hear about in porn. What they have to do is a kind of opening up, not just to another person, but to myself. When you're truly vulnerable, you can learn about yourself. And if you hold that vulnerability at bay, it's very hard to ever grow. And, like I said, I'm not saying that sex is one thing, but one of its roles, especially as we get older and especially as we commit to a partner, is it deepens relationships. And you can't do that if you're treating it like an orgasm acquisition system, which is, of course, what pornography teaches you to do. And this isn't just about pornography. In patriarchy more generally, at least the way I was raised, vulnerability was seen as weakness, and weakness was not manly. And so men are already in a kind of deficit situation when it comes to developing those emotional capacities. And again, I don't mean every man or that we all went through it the same way, but I've struggled in my own life to actually give up that control and be real in front of another person. And when that happens, it's an extraordinary experience. Right? It doesn't only happen sexually, it happens in all sorts of ways. And so vulnerability and communication are the two terms I keep coming back to when I think about sex and intimacy. And of course, pornography is about avoiding vulnerability. It's about staying in control, right? And there's no communication at all because it's simply about arousal and orgasm.
Yes, and questions about conversations also, of course, tie into the question of consent, because without conversation, there can't really be consent. And it kind of brings my mind back to the point earlier about the, normal Hollywood films. And, it just makes me think about how little consent we see on screen generally. Even in normal TV series and things like that, there's still this sort of unspoken, and it all just happens and that's it, and everybody's fine with whatever goes on. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because it just sort of stuck in my mind.
Yeah, and if I can comment on that, I think that's very important. The typical romantic movie or TV show involves people who just intuitively know what the other person wants. And sometimes that does happen. You can tell someone is in the same space you are, but it doesn't happen all the time. And miscommunication is very easy, even in the best of circumstances. And if men are trained to be shut down and view every sign of female interest as an invitation to sex, well, then the miscommunication is going to be common. And so in the US, what I wanted to point out is in the US, on some college campuses, they develop very strict codes about consent, that you have to have affirmative consent. It's not enough that she didn't say no, she has to say yes, that kind of thing. And in the mainstream culture, there was a lot of criticism of those codes, and often they were ridiculed, because every time you progress in a relationship, you're supposed to say, Do you mind if I kiss you? I feel like I would like to touch your back. May I touch your back? Okay. And it's easy to caricature that. But when people have not been trained to communicate very well, those are not necessarily bad things to work through. At some point, we hope we can all get, better in communication so that it doesn't have to be so formulaic or even legalistic. Nobody wants, a lawyer standing over them in intimate situations, obviously. But I think what that example shows is how bad so many of us are. And I don't exempt myself. I grew up totally out of touch with my own emotional life, totally out of my touch with how to behave sexually. And I needed a lot of work. And I think we should all recognize that collectively we need a lot of work on that.
Yes, we definitely do. I think we probably have time for one more question. And this was a little bit of a longer one, so I've asked for it to sort of be shortened a little bit, but I do think it's important both from the context in which it was asked, which is in Northern Ireland, if I'm not mistaken, but also for us here in the UK. And this was a question about the comments that you made earlier about choking in pornography. And we recently had a case here where a man strangled his partner to death during sex. And, he only got 4 years in prison. But the question, so that brought it to my mind, and that makes it really relevant for the, situation in the UK. But the question from the audience was really that they wanted to have non-fatal strangulation included in a domestic abuse bill, and it was excluded because there was people within the LGBTQ community who didn't want it. And she feels that it's not helpful for women who are suffering domestic violence and who are raped and often killed via strangulation. And the men are actually let off because judges say these are just sex games gone wrong. So yeah, there's just questions about that and how, what your response to that is, I guess, and how you feel pornography sort of ties into that and then becoming part of the patriarchy where women are killed and men get away with it because, it's just a sex game, that's normal, and it just went wrong.
Well, my first reaction is a kind of incredible sadness, which I think I mention only because I think it's inevitable when we talk about this. And as I said, I never know when it's going to hit me, but the thought of normalizing choking is so depraved and so devastating for women. So I agree it should be, treated as the assault it is. This so-called rough sex defense has been developing in the United States for, a long time now. And it's definitely connected to pornography because pornography presents this kind of rough sex as normal. So it's one of those places where you can't separate the pornographic culture from the larger culture. And it tells you how quick in patriarchy men are to dismiss our violence, as long as it can be tied to sexual pleasure and as long as you can claim in some sense women are somehow voluntarily participating. But everybody knows that in the real world situations where this happens, women are not consenting, women are terrified, women are terrorized. The psychological dynamics in domestic abuse are well documented. And it's extremely disconcerting that this is still going on. So yes, it's a huge problem. It reflects the larger problem, and it shows the connection to the pornographic world, which has run wild in my adult lifetime. Kind of a really depressing place that we might end. Can I offer one more thing, a kind of upbeat?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, upbeat is kind of hard in this subject, but I did, as I was talking throughout this period, I kept coming back to two specific people from that group in Minneapolis organizing against pornography. One was a woman I co-presented with, and she was great. She was incredibly skilled in front of groups. She was a rape crisis counselor as well. And one of the things I loved about her was not only that I learned so much from watching her present, but she held me accountable. And I was thinking of one particular program we did where I said something really stupid. I made fun of a woman's looks, not a woman in the room, but a woman more generally. And it was absolutely the wrong thing to do. I was very new at it. I didn't know what I was talking about. And we ended the program, we walked out, and about 20 feet out of the room, she sat me down and she said, here's what you just did wrong. And if you ever do this again, you are out of the group. You cannot talk about women's looks the way you did. And it really pulled me up short because the minute she said it, I knew she was right. But instead of her saying, oh, you know, everybody makes, she was really harsh with me. And I want to say that because when I said radical feminism is a gift to men, it doesn't mean it's always fun. There were a lot of moments in my life, and still are some, where it's painful because we see our own limitations. The other person I wanted to mention was the man who was a volunteer in that group who I spoke of, who was probably my best friend in the world for the 25 years we knew each other. He sadly died a while ago. His name was Jim Coplin, and he was important because he was a role model for what it meant to be a principled man in a feminist movement, what it meant to be critically self-reflective, and what it meant to not be afraid to be fully human in front of another man. And Jim might be the first man I ever felt like I could be vulnerable in front of. And it was an extraordinary gift that he gave to me. I miss him every day. I wrote a book about him after he died called Plain Radical, because he was a really exceptional person. And so I want to again emphasize that feminism is a real opportunity for us men to grow, and it involves listening to women and not being afraid when they call us up on our failures. And it also means being tender with each other. And Jim was one of the most tender men I've ever met, and I miss him. And so, again, I can control my emotions sometimes in these things, but I think that's important to say because that's the only way out of this trap that patriarchy sets for us. So thanks again for allowing me to be part of this. I really enjoyed it. And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, if you put my name into Google, Robert Jensen, my page is the first one that comes up. Feel free to send me an email, communicate. I'd love to hear more. Thanks.
No, thank you, Robert. As I said before, thank you very much for volunteering your time and all your honesty. You know, just like at the end there, you're just sort of really highlighting, you know, the personal aspects of this and things, you know, confronting things that aren't always easy, having people there to, you know, challenge you, but also having people there who challenge you because they care about you and they're kind to you, and, you know, enabling, you know, us to have these difficult conversations, because they can be really difficult, but we do need those challenges as well. And it's, you know, I think from what you said, the thing that I get is it's about the balance of that, having the challenge that is difficult at times, but not then, you know, rejecting the person.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you very much for this brilliant talk. You know, people have been really enjoying it. There's so many great messages coming in. You know, I love this man. It's the one that made me smile. You know, super insightful. So yeah, I just want to say thanks again. You know, I've heard you speak so many times, and yeah, I could just listen to you talk for hours, because I think it's the humility and the honesty that you bring with it. It's really approachable, and it's always really clear. And yeah, it's just been a real privilege. So thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for hanging in. Appreciate it. All right.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.